The world braces for the economic fallout as President Donald Trump announces sweeping new tariffs on all imports to the US, with tariffs ranging from 10% to 49%. Industries from China to Europe will feel the pressure. These measures signal a dramatic shift in global trade relations, with retaliatory responses already in motion. Will these tariffs lead to a trade war or a new era of economic independence for the US? How will global leaders navigate the challenges ahead? These questions and more will be discussed here on In Depth. Thank you for joining us.
Donald John Trump, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully take office of President of the United States.
Capital open, the emergence and reciprocity.
Mexico, Canada,
Greenland.
Also, and I don't.
Axios has reported that the announcement of new tariffs by Donald Trump has sent shockwaves through global leadership. According to the news outlet, the reciprocal tariffs will affect dozens of countries, including some of the US's biggest trading partners. Reactions have been mixed, with some leaders urging caution, while others have pledged to fight back against the decision. For example, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated that the EU is finalizing a first package of countermeasures in response to tariffs on steel and is preparing for further action. In a statement, China's Commerce Ministry expressed strong opposition, declaring it would resolutely adopt countermeasures to safeguard its rights and interests. A spokesperson also remarked there is no winner in a trade war and protectionism leads to nowhere. US President Donald Trump has announced sweeping new tariffs that are set to shake the global trade system. Starting April 4th, tariffs on all imports will rise by 10%, with steep increases for certain countries, including China, the EU, and Japan.
In an unprecedented move, U.S. President Donald Trump's administration has announced tariffs that will affect global trade. This decision has triggered concerns worldwide, with trade partners fearing economic fallout. The 10% baseline tariff will apply to all imports, with countries like China facing a staggering 34% rate. The European Union will see a 20% tariff, and countries like Vietnam and Cambodia will experience duties as high as 49%. This shift reverses decades of free trade policies that have defined the post-World War II era. Experts predict the immediate consequences will be felt by U.S. consumers, who may face rising prices for everyday goods. While Trump calls it a step toward economic independence, critics warn it could spark inflation and slow down economic growth. Countries are already preparing for retaliatory measures, which could further escalate tensions. In Europe, leaders are expressing frustration, with many warning that the move could harm both sides of the Atlantic. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni commented by saying that Italy can work towards an agreement with the United States with the goal of avoiding a trade war that could inevitably weaken the West. As the tariff measures come into effect, the global community faces an uncertain economic future. The full impact of these tariffs will only unfold in the coming months as markets adjust to the sudden shift in trade policy.
To help us analyze the consequences of these decisions, we're joined from New York by Justin Russell, Executive Director of the Global Foreign Policy Center, and from Washington by Peter Roth, Contributing Editor at Newsweek. Thank you both for joining us. First, let's start off
Good to be with you.
Excuse me?
Good to be with you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. Sorry, didn't catch that. Let's start off with Mr. Russell. President Trump, new tariffs will impact countries like China and the EU. What do you think will be the immediate effect on the global markets in general?
Well, we're seeing the global markets effect right now. I mean, the just within the past hour, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is the benchmark for the U.S. stock market here on Wall Street, is down 1,550 points. It's lost 3.6% of its total value. The Nasdaq, which is another big market for over-the-counter stocks, you look at that, it has dropped 925 points. It's lost almost 5.5% of its total value. The markets are not reacting well. The reaction globally, as we're seeing, is they're not coming to the table immediately to try and negotiate a deal with Donald Trump. What they're doing is they're going to push back, and they're going to form their own trade alliances outside of the U.S. And the U.S. economy is going to be left alone to suffer for it.
Okay, Mr. Roth, what about you? What are your thoughts on this? Do you think that the rest of the world will not play ball basically with the U.S.?
Markets don't like change, and anytime there's a major shift in economic policy, the markets react badly. You raise taxes, you lower taxes, you impose tariffs, you take tariffs off. Markets react badly. That's not to say the policy is good or bad. It's just the market reaction is what we expect. The way the president has framed the issue, China, the EU, India, Middle Eastern countries, African countries, other countries in Asia, they all have walls around them. And in order to get our goods and services over those walls, we have to pay an extra fee, a tariff, a tax.
Yes.
The United States, the walls are relatively low. Some people don't have to pay anything to get over them. The president regards that as inequitable, and a number of the people who voted him into office the second time also regard that as inequitable, and he's taking steps to address that. Now, remember, if we believe that the imposition of tariffs on goods coming into the United States are bad for American consumers, you have to believe that in the EU, in China, in Japan, in India, they believe that raising the tariffs on our goods coming into their country is equally bad for consumers. So retaliation is not necessarily beneficial to them. The question here is who's going to blink first, who's going to lower their duties. And the president, merely by talking about imposing tariffs, has gotten countries to change their behavior, gotten countries to commit to lowering or actually lowering their tariffs. This means, I think, that ultimately the Trump proposal will be scaled back from where it is in most instances, and that most countries will automatically move to freer, fairer trade, not free trade, but freer and fairer trade, because they can afford the consequence of being unable to sell their goods and their services in the American economy.
Okay, Mr. Russell, how do these tariffs differ from the previous tariff strategies, and what makes this move more significant to the U.S. economy? I'm sure you've heard Mr. Roth talking about the idea of, possibility of having more of a fair trade. Is this something that you envision in the future when it comes to these tariffs?
There's several questions here. Basically, what Mr. Roth is saying is we're going to blow up the tariff schedule and these trade agreements, and it will help the U.S. economy. That's just simply not true. There's not an economist in this country that believes that what is happening now by doing the nuclear option on tariffs globally is going to help the U.S. economy. The bottom line here is one of the things that he's doing is he is taking a shot and has taken a shot at our two biggest trading partners, Mexico and Canada. And the reality is he's blowing up his own trade agreement that he put together in his first term. This makes no sense. The other option here is that if we are truly looking at a sustainable economic situation for the U.S., what we have to look at is these folks are not going to go back to the they're not going to go back to the they're not going to go back to the U.S. trying to make a deal. What they're going to do is they're going to try and make a deal with themselves. India has great manufacturing capabilities. China has great manufacturing capabilities. The bottom line here is this is something that is going to take part, and they'll start working with even our adversaries. Russia have manufacturing capabilities. Us thinking that this is all going to be a good thing for the U.S., I think we're living in a dream world, and it's not realistic.
Okay, Mr. Roth, what about you? Many global leaders are already warning about the escalating trade barriers. We talked about this, or you talked about it. Do you think that these tariffs could lead to a full-blown trade war, or is this just turbulence that we're going to see, I suppose, in the next few months, maybe a year?
It could lead to a full-blown trade war, but I think you're right that it's more likely turbulence. Not terrorism, turbulence.
Yes, it's just turbulence.
But
yes.
big difference there. Sorry, early in the morning here. But I will say that there are economists who do believe that this will have a beneficial effect on the U.S. economy. I don't happen to be one of them. I regard tariffs as taxes, and I think that taxes take money out of the private sector and put it into the public sector where it's wasted and not invested. So I'm not a fan, but I'm more of a skeptic, and I'm certainly willing to see if this works or not. There are a number of countries. China is particularly open to criticism, not just because of their tariffs on U.S. goods, but because of the trade barriers, which the president also talked about, and are somehow part of his calculation of what the tariff rates will be. The trade barriers that are imposed on U.S. companies that want to do business with China or in China. Surrendering intellectual property, surrendering proprietary information, kinds of workers they have to hire. I mean, there are all kinds of barriers, and those barriers are not economically good. I mean, free trade is foundational to global prosperity, and I think there is widespread agreement on that point. But I think, as in many things with Mr. Trump, this is a high risk negotiation that he is starting because the current global trade regime is not fair to American consumers.
As
and
you said,
American
sir, it's high risk. I mean, you talked about like trade wars and the idea of appropriation of certain products. We had an issue years back related to the microchips issue when America and China were having a bit of an economic spat, I suppose. It halted a lot of industries, including the car industry. Do you think this is also possible? I mean, people can be stubborn, or governments
Well,
can be stubborn.
it's certainly possible again, but all the chips now most of the chips come from Taiwan. And unfortunately, the government response here in the United States, which was the CHIPS Act, was supposedly to divert billions from the private sector to the public sector so it could be given back to the private sector to stimulate chip production, failed miserably. The government solution is always something one needs to be suspicious of. Much rather have free markets settle differences. Now, unfortunately, tariffs are one of those things that the free market can't settle because that's a government-to-government issue, and governments impose tariffs. And if tariffs don't work, the Republicans will suffer politically. They will probably lose control of the House of Representatives in the next election, maybe the Senate, although that's less likely given who's up and where. But if they lose control of the House, then you'll get legislation to repeal the tariffs. It is shocking to me the way that the Democratic Party has abandoned its 50-year post-war history of protectionism and support for organized labor in its tough talk on free trade now. The Democrats are now advocating for free trade as opposed to protectionism. That is a seismic shift here in the U.S. political model, and we'll see how that plays out as well. But it represents the changes in the coalitions that came together in support of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump in the last presidential election. The high net worth, college-educated, postgraduate, urban voter who used to be a Republican has moved left and is now voting Democrat. And so while they support liberal social policies, On economics, they believe in lower taxes and and lower tariffs. It really is a disruptive change that is going to take time to process through the American political system.
Okay, Mr. Russell, what about you? What's your opinion on this? That, Mr. Roth talked about the idea of a rift between both parties, the Democratic and Republican Party, when it comes to economic policies. Do you think this is going to spill over into mainstream politics as well, not just economic wars or trade wars?
Of course it is. Of course it is. Look, the Trump administration has been promoting this idea that, and he did it during the campaign, is that tariffs are going to come in and the U.S. economy is going to benefit. The government is going to collect these tariffs and we're going to put it back into the Treasury and everybody's going to have a windfall over it. It's definitely not true. Everybody knows when you tariff products that are imported, that cost is put down to the consumer. And quite frankly, the U.S. has created an entitled consumer base. We love buying $210 55-inch flat screen TVs that are made in China. Now those TVs are going to go up to almost $400. That's a big deal. We can't make those TVs at that cost here. We barely make TVs now. So now we're either going to have a supply chain issue where we're not going to be able to buy anything. And if we're not buying anything, the ripple effect is going to be horrendous for the economy domestically. But if we are going to do that, people aren't going to buy new stuff. So there's a big challenge here for the Trump administration, and it's not going to be a long issue or a long landing strip for them to do this. The second prices go up, this is going to cause inflation to go up. It's going to the price of consumable goods are going to go up. We have to import eggs now because of the mishandling of this. And if we're putting tariffs on those eggs, Donald Trump in the Rose Garden yesterday was talking about how proud he was that the price of eggs have dropped 40%. Well, if you're importing them from countries where there's a 55% tariff, now you got a real problem. There's no logic to this, and I understand Mr. Roth has stated there's one or two economists that have said, well, this might work. A large amount of the U.S. economists that people use to analyze global geopolitical influence into U.S. economic policies are throwing their hands up in the air and saying, look, this does not make sense. We're either going to have a disruption in our just-in-time logistics system, which the U.S. economy is based on, and we're going to see empty shelves at the supermarket and where we go to buy our goods, even at the box stores.
Okay, Mr. Roth, Mr. Russell seems to be, not very optimistic about what's going to happen in the near future. But given the reactions from the global leaders, where do you see this policy leading to in terms of international diplomacy and the global economy?
It's been very clear that Donald Trump intends to use America's economic leverage to enhance America's position globally. That's a political decision. It's an economic decision. It's a national security decision. It's all part of the tariff argument. But Justin brought up the just-in-time inventory system, and we saw when the government shut everything down during the COVID pandemic for little to no benefit in stopping the pandemic and in incurring enormous damage in the public sector, in joblessness, in healthcare, and in other areas. We need to rethink the just-in-time system that relies so much on imports, because in a crisis like that, and there could be another crisis like that, Americans can't get the products they need. This is an incentive for certain kinds of companies in certain sectors to rethink their manufacturing strategy and bring their business back to the United States. I think that's an indirect consequence of the tariff conversation. But as the president pointed out yesterday, Johnson & Johnson, Apple, other major companies are putting multi-billion-dollar investments into new plants and manufacturing in the United States. The other thing that's going to happen here is that there is a reason that TVs made in China are $200 and that we can't make them here.
labor
beyond
costs, isn't
just
it?
the fact that Chinese workers work for so little. And we need to take a systemic look at how the government policies in the states and national affect the ability of American companies to be competitive by manufacturing goods and services here in the United States. There are other ways to increase productivity and bring prices down.
Okay, Mr. Russell, you spoke a bit about U.S. consumers and how it's going to affect markets in general in the U.S. and maybe in the near future supermarkets won't have a lot of products available. But how will the U.S. consumer be affected by the tariff changes in terms of pricing of goods? Do you think it's going to be positive or negative? Because President Trump talked about the idea that this is going to actually help the average American rather than, affect them negatively and take away from their money.
Look, let me just be clear about one thing, is that the reality is we don't know what is going to happen here. We're looking into a crystal ball and we're trying to analyze something that has never been tested before. We have never seen a large-scale nuclear option tariff protocol be put out by the White House. It just doesn't make sense. What we can look at, where we've gotten into trade wars with other, trading partners, we can go back and look at aluminum, steel, softwood lumber with Canada even. Those prices have directly affected the pocketbooks of the American electorate. Again, I go back to the point I made before. The idea that tariffs are country to country is simply not true.
So do you think if it had been rolled out slower, it might have been helpful?
The reality is that we have a U.S. trade representative whose job is to negotiate these deals and maintain a standing of the fairest trade deal that we can get. That is the individual that should be running this, and it's usually done as part of a quieter diplomatic negotiational process that they are not using right now. This is a matter of Donald Trump wanting to show he's the big boss, which he is. I mean, everybody serves at the pleasure of the president. But the bottom line here is that the U.S. Trade Representative should be negotiating these things. There are ways of doing it. There are protocols of doing it. But what this does is this puts the entire economic security of every American investor, every American consumer, great risk, because there is no model for this. That's the problem.
Okay, Mr. Roth, you heard Mr. Russell. He's talking about uncharted waters, basically. But how does this tariff decision align with Trump's broader foreign policy goals? Do you think that this is related to policies towards the EU, for instance, or Latin American countries?
Absolutely, and I have to say, if that's the advice that Justin is giving to his clients, talking about a nuclear option on tariffs, no wonder the markets are down. The analysts are not taking a wait and see attitude, which is probably a little bit too laissez-faire, but they're trashing the proposal. I think that's dramatically unnecessary. I think that we do need to take the wait and see attitude. We need to understand the potential for the downside, but we also have to look for the upsides, and I do think they're there. Remember that Donald Trump considers himself the head of the America First movement. I don't consider myself part of that movement, but he does. And he believes that raising barriers to imports from countries that have high barriers that block American exports from coming in is good for American business and American workers, because it will, the market response will be to create more jobs, more manufacturing here in the United States. We are on the edge of an energy revolution driven not by Joe Biden's Green New Deal, but by changes in the nuclear industry, driven by the tech industry that needs huge electric power to generate AI and other activities in cyberspace. That's driving forward the idea of microreactors, which may reduce power costs tremendously.
Yes,
And that's
I
the
apologize.
kind of that's the
I sort of
kind
have
of
to
thing
cut you.
that you have to look for.
Yes, I
To s-
apologize. I just have to cut you off there because we're out of time for this episode. But thank you both so much for joining us. That was Peter Roth, a contributing editor at Newsweek, and Justin Russell, the executive director of the Global Foreign Policy Centre. Thank you both for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure having you. And this brings us to the end of today's episode of In Depth. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more updates here on Qnews.